for the next 8 weeks or so. I've been asked to act as chair for this first session, which I'm very happy to do. There are some announcements that I've been asked to make first before I introduce today's speakers. Firstly, well, I've set them out here on this slide. Volume 914 of JFM has now been published. It contains what I could describe as the virtual proceedings of the centenary event. This is, you see here, the web address where you can find this volume. It's open access, and there's a large number of papers there for you to browse through. Secondly, this is actually a continuation of the online IUTAM symposium that was held at the end of March to celebrate the centenary of George Batchelor, who actually started these Friday afternoon seminars in 1948, starting a tradition that continues to this day. So we have a lot to live up to. Now, videos of the lectures that were given in March are also now online. They're accessible at this second address, another cambridge.org, a slightly different address from the journal's one, but you can find the videos of the lectures there. I am asked to point out that this session is being recorded, but if you don't want to figure in the recordings, just remain muted and with your video turned off. Questions during the seminars are encouraged, preferably via chat, or if it's very urgent, by hand waving, although I might not see you, and unmuting. But we'll respond to the chat questions at the end of each seminar. There are two, each of about 20 minutes. I just want to draw your attention to the souvenir notebook that was produced back in March and circulated to those who had registered for the meeting. A few copies still remain. If you have not received one and would like one, then please email me. Give your best mailing address, maybe your home address, because it can be difficult to pick things up from departments still. Anyway, if you give me your mailing address, I will send you a copy. And it is a question of first come, first serve, because when I run out, that's it. Okay, let me come to the speakers. Our first speaker today is Jesse Capecelatro, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Mechanical Engineering at the University of Michigan. Jesse took his PhD back in 2014 at Cornell University and is now head of his research group at Michigan. His area, of course, is fluid mechanics with emphasis on multiphase and granular flow, turbulence, combustion, and high performance computing, with applications in renewable energy, carbon capture, environmental flows, aerosols, turbomachinery, and space. You can't be much broader than that. So here, Jesse, over to you.
All right. Well, thanks a lot, Keith. And I'd also like to thank Paul and Kathleen and everyone who's organized this seminar series. At least for me during the pandemic, it's been really nice to be able to watch these the talks and also participate. So this has been really nice. So just quick acknowledgements. I'm mostly going to be covering the paper that appeared in the special edition, which I'm showing here. My student, Sarah Beetham, was a first author. And so she's been really, in our group, leading this data-driven effort for turbulence modeling. And I'll talk about that. This work really started during my PhD with my advisor, Olivier Desjardins, and collaborator, Rodney Fox. And since I left Cornell, Rodney and myself have continued to collaborate. This has proven to be a quite challenging problem, as I hope to convey in this talk, but it's also, I think, quite exciting. And I think it really opens the door for some of these newer ideas in data science to play a role. So my goal is really to motivate, what do I mean by strongly coupled particle-laden flows? What are some of the challenges with turbulence modeling when you have strong coupling between the phases? And talk a little bit about the relevant physics. And I'm going to attempt to do that in the next 18 minutes or so. These are some examples of the types of flows we look at. So most of my funding these days are coming from NASA. So looking at plume surface interactions when a spacecraft's approaching a planet, and the exhaust plumes fluidize the surface. So turns out to be a multi-phase flow problem that's really challenging to design for. But obviously, particle-laden flows or turbulent gas particle flows play roles in environmental applications, disease transmission, and what I'll be referring to throughout this talk is for energy generation. This is showing a chemical looping reactor at the National Energy Technology Lab. So we'll come back to that. But in my research group, one of my overarching goals is really to advance multiphase turbulence modeling to the same level of maturity or success that we see for single phase flows. So there's still a lot to be done when it comes to single phase turbulence modeling. But I would argue that for multiphase flows really lags sort of where we're at with the success that I've seen in single phase flows. And so some of the quantities of interest that we'd like to be able to predict are things like the mean settling velocity. So if you have a particle suspension, looking at the average settling speed in that suspension, the turbulent kinetic energy of both phases and high order statistics, among other things. And it's difficult to talk about particle sedimentation at settling velocities without bringing up some of the seminal works by George Batchelor, and so I thought it'd be appropriate here. If you consider a viscous flow and you have a suspension of rigid spherical particles, in this case we'll consider very low concentration, low Reynolds numbers, homogeneous suspension. Batchelor came up with the famous correlation for the hindered settling. So the idea here is the average velocity of the particles in that suspension will be less than what that settling velocity would be for an isolated particle, based on this relationship with the volume fraction, the average volume fraction of that suspension. And since this paper that appeared in August 1971, there's been a number of corrections and modifications to this. But this idea that in a viscous flow, particles will settle at a different rate than it's an individual isolated particle. Now, the story is a little different for turbulent flows. So now let's consider the case, again, rigid spherical particles, low concentration. So we're talking about such low concentration that the particles aren't influencing the background turbulence. So the flow is agnostic to the fact that the particles are there. Large density ratio. So everything I'll be talking about in this talk is gas solid. So density ratio is above 1,000. And for this case, if we consider particles smaller than the Kolmogorov length scale, the idea of enhanced settling instead of hindered settling has been observed and quantified because heavy particles are known to preferentially sweep the downward side of vortices as they pass through a turbulent flow. And so this is an image from Wang and Maxey's JFM paper from 1993 that sort of depicts this idea of a particle settling through these eddies and resulting in hindered settling. Enhanced settling. But what I want to talk about is a slightly different scenario. So in this case, I'm still interested in high Reynolds number or moderate Reynolds numbers, high density ratio, so gas solid. But now if we increase the volume fraction, getting towards 1%, so unlike a lot of the work on preferential sweeping and preferential concentration usually considers very low concentration, 1e minus 4, 1e minus 5. But here we're going to increase it to about 1%, such that the particle loading on the background flow can't be ignored. And in this case, it becomes in my opinion, far more complicated scenario because the particles have an order 1 effect on the background turbulence that can't be ignored. And again, this is showing a snapshot in that chemical looping reactor I showed earlier. And due to the strong coupling between the phases, particles will fall and feel a reduced drag where the concentration's higher, and they'll generate these or spontaneously form these dense clusters that are quite dynamic and chaotic and have a large influence on the flow. And that's the regime that I'm interested in to talk about in this talk. And I thought a good place to start, being a fluid mechanics seminar, is with the Navier-Stokes equations. So here we have incompressible Navier-Stokes. Should look familiar to everyone. And the nice thing is, if we directly solve these equations with sufficient resolution so we can apply boundary conditions at the surface of each particle, we could exactly describe these types of flows, albeit, assuming rigid and non-reacting. But obviously, this is not feasible at any relevant scale even with modern supercomputers. There's been a lot of advancements and very exciting work with particle resolved simulations, but still, if we go back to those environmental applications or these large chemical looping reactors with trillions of particles, it's just not feasible. And one of the takeaways of this talk, I hope, is that unlike with single-phase turbulence modeling, the idea would be to apply some type of averaging directly to these equations and then look at modeling those unclosed terms. And what I hope to get across is you can't really, it's not that straightforward for multiphase flows. And so the approach that I tend to take is follows what Anderson and Jackson did back in 1967, where you come up with a locally averaged or intermediate set of equations based on volume filtering. Now, there's a number of different ways to arrive at these equations. Some are deterministic, some it can be considered stochastic, some are based on ensemble averaging. But what we'll do is take the Navier-Stokes equations, apply a local filter or local volume average, and what we end up with are now a new set of equations that directly account for the volume fraction. So continuity, we no longer have divergence of U 0 because we have changing volume fractions. And then in our momentum equation, we have, it looks fairly similar to what we had before, but now we have volume fractions appearing in the divergence time derivative. And we have this term here due to interphase momentum exchange. So here phi is what I call the mass loading. So it's the ratio of the mass of the particle phase to fluid. And that's going to dictate how important this two-way coupling is. And this interphase exchange will contain, at least in this scenario, drag between the phases. And so we have the velocity difference between the phases, a time scale, and then a correction. So this, if FD here is 1, that's just Stokes drag. But we're interested in Reynolds numbers based on the particle diameter on order of 1 to 10. So we need to correct for that. And then the particles also, or the momentum exchange includes the resolved stresses, fluid stresses. And so the approach that I advocate for is to, instead of averaging the directly Navier-Stokes, we average these intermediate set of equations. And the reason for that is that it will allow us to retain more physics, and we'll have unclosed terms that have more physical meaning. And I'll show that in more detail. And what we'll have to do, though, is reconcile the fact that we have all these volume fractions popping up everywhere. And so when we apply an average, and so that you could think of this as a Reynolds average, to a quantity, we're going to introduce this notion of phase averaging. So this is analogous to Favre averaging of variable density flows, but instead of the density weighted, this is either a particle volume fraction weighting or a fluid volume fraction weighting. And then we can define fluctuations based on either the particle phase average, which I'll give with two primes, or a fluctuation about the fluid phase average, which is 3 primes here. And I'm not going to go through all of the equations because it'll be a very long and boring talk if I did that. But I want to focus just on 2 equations after you apply this averaging that I think shows some interesting physics. One is if we average the particle velocity, so now we have a momentum equation for the average phase average particle velocity. And then we get this equation here if we assume homogeneous flow. And if we assume we have gas-solid flow, so large density ratio, these terms can be neglected. And if we assume statistically stationary flows, what we find is that the average particle velocity in our suspension is equal to tau p times g. So this would be exactly what we call the terminal velocity. Tau p is the response time, Stokes response time of the particle. But we also have this extra term. So this is the fluid velocity that's weighted by the particle volume fraction. And so you can think of this as the fluid velocity seen by the particles. So if there's no correlation between the particle volume fraction and fluid velocity, then this term is 0, and the average settling speed is just equal to the terminal velocity of an isolated particle. But in the scenario that we had showed before, where there's strong coupling, and particles clusters tend to entrain the flow, and you get what's called jet bypassing. So in this riser scenario, you get high-speed jets of flow in the dilute regions, and then you get downward flow in the dense clusters. You can see that the volume fraction, local volume fraction and fluid velocity is highly correlated. And this leads to enhanced settling. And so the average particle velocity in the suspension will be larger than the terminal velocity of an isolated particle due to this correlation between volume fraction and fluid velocity. So this is an important term that would be considered unclosed and requires modeling. And now, in addition to the particle velocity, I want to just briefly show what the fluid TKE looks like. The terms here, so this is assuming we have one non-homogeneous direction. So you could think of, say, a channel flow. We have these terms in blue are what appears for classic single-phase turbulence, right? So this is our Reynolds, our RANS equations, or Reynolds stress equation for the fluid TKE, where we have convection of our turbulent Reynolds stress. This epsilon here is a pressure redistribution and viscous diffusion. We have the usual production of TKE due to mean gradients, and then our usual dissipation rate due to viscous dissipation. So these terms in blue are what would appear when we typically do Reynolds averaging for, say, a channel flow. But these red terms are what appear now when we average those volume filtered equations. So we get these two extra terms. This DE is the drag exchange. So this represents correlations between fluid velocity fluctuations and particle velocity fluctuations, and it's multiplied by the mass loading and divided by the particle response time. So this is what we'd call, this is how energy, turbulent kinetic energy, is transferred between the fluid and particles. And again, when two-way coupling is not important and the mass loading is small, this term goes to 0. And then this last term is what we call drag production. And so we have a mean velocity difference between the phases, which is closed. Again, it's proportional to the mass loading. But now we have this drift velocity. This is that same fluid velocity seen by the particle that we had before. And so we see when there's correlation between particle velocity fluctuations and volume fraction fluctuations, i.e. if there's strong clustering, we now have this production term, which means that TKE can be produced even in the absence of mean shear. So if we had a homogeneous suspension, you can still have production of TKE due to drag by the particle phase. And this is why turbulence modeling is challenging for these regimes, because you can't just take existing single phase closure and augment them or correct them for particles, because there are no existing single phase turbulence closure for these terms. And this is what we're going to focus on. So to summarize, the approach we're taking is you could start down at the micro scale, volume filter those equations. You get an intermediate set of equations that allow you to account for these clustering and this mesoscale dynamics. And then we directly average those equations to come up with the turbulence models for the macro scale. And what you need to avoid is directly averaging the micro scale, because you're going to lose a lot of important physics, like this drag production term and these important correlations with volume fractions that are missed if you directly average just from the micro scale. So it's a sort of stair-stepped approach. And so in order to generate useful data to inform turbulence modeling, we're using our in-house code NGA. And so we're directly solving those volume filter momentum equations. And then we're doing this with Lagrangian particle tracking. So we track each individual particle according to Newton's second law. We're not resolving to the subparticle scale, as I mentioned, because in order to see clustering, you need millions of particles. And so this becomes very challenging with particle resolved DNS. So we have to rely on a drag model. And so we have drag models based on local Reynolds number volume fraction. The particles also field resolved stresses. And then we also account for collisions between particles based on a saw sphere collision model. So particles are treated as a mass spring damper to avoid contact, and there's an appropriate coefficient of restitution. Okay, so briefly, I just want to show what this looks like for, say, a turbulent channel flow before showing some of the turbulence closure. So imagine we have just a classic, fully developed turbulent channel. This is what I'm showing at the top. And if we see this with a very dilute suspension of particles, our mass loading is 0.2, so the mass loading is not very large. This Reynolds number is 10,000 of the channel. We see the budget of TKE, the shear production is balanced by viscous dissipation. This is what we're all familiar with from classic single phase flow. The particles aren't doing much at low mass loading. Same scenario, same Reynolds number, same number, same density ratio between the particles and fluid, but now we just increase the number of particles, so our mass loading is 2, and we see that there's enhanced dissipation by the drag coupling, and the turbulence is completely relaminarized, and the terms in the budget just get washed out. We keep adding more particles, so now we're at 1% concentration, our mass loading is 20, and now the story is very different. We have production of TKE entirely by drag production, balanced by drag exchange, and you can see these dense clusters are inducing all of the TKE. So it's all we're doing, same Reynolds number, we just increase the particle loading, and the physics changes quite a bit. And we could briefly look at the energy and see that at low concentration, low mass loading, particles really target the high wave number components of TKE, but at larger mass loading, larger volume fraction, the TKE reduction is broadband across all scales. Okay, I don't want to go over, so in the last 2-3 minutes, I want to actually get to the main thing I want to show is, let's consider what I think of as the simplest possible flow where two-way coupling between the phases drives the flow. And so this is a homogeneous suspension of particles. The flow is at rest, random distribution of particles. They fall under gravity, they cluster, and now all of the turbulent kinetic energy in the fluid phase is driven by the two-way coupling. And what we're going to do is run different Reynolds numbers or different Archimedes numbers, so by changing gravity, and we could generate a bunch of data. One thing we see is that we observe enhanced settling. So the average particle velocity is on the order of 2 times the terminal velocity of an isolated particle. But now what we have to do is close all of those terms appearing in the RANS equations. And that's where I've been the last couple of years. We have all of this data, and we need to close these terms, but it's a fairly high dimensional space, even for this very simple flow where it's homogeneous, statistically stationary. We have a number of unclosed terms, and that could be potentially dependent on a large number of parameters. And so that's why we've started looking at sort of data-driven approaches for model closure. And when we started looking into this, we decided not to use neural networks. We wanted to have a model that would give us an algebraic expression, something that would be interpretable. And so my student Sarah, she's been following closely what Steve Brunton and others, have developed, this idea of doing sparse identification. And I'm going to briefly just go through this. I apologize, I'm getting close to 20 minutes. We have data. We want to represent that as a set of coefficients, a nonlinear. So this could be a nonlinear function of a principal invariance and a set of coefficients. And to come up with a model, we solve an optimization problem where we have an L2 norm where we want to minimize the discrepancy between our data and the model. But we also have an L1 norm, so it makes sure that the model is sparse. So it really identifies the terms that are important and gets rid of what's not important. And this will result in a compact algebraic closure. One challenge is we need to know something about the basis tensors. So if you open up Steve Pope's Turbulence book, you can find a lot of information on basis tensors for single phase flow. What we showed in our JFM paper in this edition is what the basis tensors look like for multiphase flow. So it's a little more involved. We have relative velocities between the phases, and we have Reynolds stresses of the fluid and the particle. But we could plug that into this optimization, and we can start looking at modeling the individual terms in the Reynolds stress. So for example, this is the drag production term. And I don't want to spend too much time here, but the main idea is now we have an algebraic closure based on mass loading, relative velocity that's sparse. And it gives us good results. And in order to see how well it does, we can take this case, which was this closure was developed for statistically stationary homogeneous flows, so really one data point for each closure. And what we did is we reversed gravity and looked at the transient behavior at this, and the model, how the Reynolds stress model works for predicting the mean settling velocity for different flow configurations, and it actually does quite well. And so the main takeaway is these flows are quite complicated. You can't simply just average your Navier-Stokes equations and look at what you typically do for single phase. But doing this intermediate step of volume filtering and then averaging shows you what needs to be closed. And this sparse identification is what we think is quite an attractive approach for doing model closure. We're now looking at more complicated flows, so wall-bounded flows, and also flows with heat and mass transfer. So this is showing a biomass devolatilization or pyrolysis in these clustered flows that I think would be, without these data-driven approaches, becomes very, very challenging. So again, I apologize. I was trying to cover a lot of material in 20 minutes. And just to summarize here, multiphase turbulence modeling cannot follow traditional approaches of directly averaging Navier-Stokes. Particle clustering leads to enhanced settling and production of TKE, even in the absence of mean shear. And I think there's a lot of interesting opportunities of using machine learning and other data-driven approaches because without that, these closures become quite difficult and challenging. And with that, at least my timer says 20 minutes. I'm happy to take any questions, and I really appreciate the opportunity to give this talk.
Well, thank you very much, Jesse. A beautiful talk. And I think George Batchelor would have loved it, because
he's done a lot with turbulence and with particles, right? So it's a nice,
well, it combines both areas of his turbulence, the first half of his career, and sedimentation and micro hydrodynamics, the second half, and you put it all together. It's an exceedingly difficult area to work in, and I think you've done marvelously well. What you've achieved so far and how you've managed to convey it so well in 20 minutes. Wonderful. Just a comment, your SINDY, S-I-N-D-Y approach seems very similar to some approaches in plasma physics, where a Vlasov equation has been derived from particle in cell calculations. How did you decide on your library functions?
So that's a good point. If I interpret this question correctly, the idea here is we're running Euler-Lagrange simulations, which you can think of as particle and cell. The way we do the two-way coupling is a little more involved than just particle and cell, but it's very analogous. And then from that, we need to average and look at closure. And if I understand this correctly, when we do this sparse identification, we need to come up with okay, what is the model going to be a function of? Volume fraction, Reynolds stresses, slip velocities, but then also what should it be? What combination of algebraic functions do we expect it to be based on? And right now, we take the basis tensors and we look at coefficients in front of those basis tensors to different powers. But that's pretty limited. And so what we're looking at now is using other ideas of machine learning, like gene expression, to try to come up with what are those, I think what you're referring to as library functions, more general or broad functions, functional forms that this could take on. And so this is a very new area we're getting into to sort of generalize that. I hope that answers your question, Steve.
Yeah, no, thanks. That was a great answer. You may like to look at the plasma physics, some of the literature, actually. They're doing very similar similar things.
I wasn't aware of that, so I very much would be interested in seeing that.
Thank you.
We have a second question from Cleo Loy regarding the relaminarization phenomenon at higher mass loading. Could you say a bit more about, and now I'm afraid I've lost the rest
Sure,
of the
yeah, I think I got the question. So the idea here is we have a turbulent channel flow and we throw some particles in there. So what are the particles doing to the flow? Well, the flow feels local volume displacement due to the volume fraction effects, and then feels drag. And drag, the effect of drag on the flow is complicated because particles can induce wakes that enhance TKE, but they can also dissipate TKE at the same time. And so all we're doing to go from this turbulent channel flow from here to here is we're just adding more particles, so the mass loading's increased. And we see this relaminarization. Now, in both cases, we have the same Reynolds number. So this case, in order to maintain the same Reynolds number, it has a larger pressure drop. So I don't want this to be interpreted as we're seeing drag reduction. This isn't, that's a different story. So we have a higher pressure drop in order to maintain the same Reynolds number. But the relaminarization is due to the fact that these particles start to assemble into coherent structures, but they're not really dense. And so it's really, it's reducing the local velocity fluctuations where the concentration's increased. Once you have more particles in denser clusters, those clusters will actually induce large wakes that now start contributing back to the TKE. So this intermediate range really happens when that mass loading hits about 1. So that's a volume fraction of, if I don't remember, 0.1% about for this density ratio. And it's when it's dense enough that it's killing off those velocity fluctuations, but not dense enough that we have these dense clusters that are inducing wakes. That's I think the best I understand it at the moment. This was published in a 2019 JFM paper that has a little more detail.